Have you heard of, I think this is another thing that Kripal was telling me about, but there's a phenomena with young children having memories of previous lives. And they're having memories of like violence in previous lives or violent deaths. And he is connecting, he made a connection to trauma. So like like violent or extremely physical or emotional traumatic experiences having to do with this brain filter opening up, right, and letting in more. And there's been many people, some of which I've had on the show before, who have had lives filled with trauma and just terrible, terrible childhoods that now have these crazy paranormal, phenomenal, unexplainable experiences in their daily lives. And these children, going back to these children who claim to have memories of previous lives, they were overwhelmingly male in their previous lives. And the reason Jeff believes, his idea of why this is because in the past, in history, males were far more likely to die violent deaths than females.
Yeah. That's fascinating. You're getting into the topic of, in the scholarly literature, they call it cases of reincarnation experience or core, but that's basically pointing at reincarnation.
Right. And it's interesting that children have it. It's children that are like on the cusp. It's before they actually learn language. Yeah. Before they can actually speak and have a conversation in whatever language they're going to learn, right? Like there's some weird little pocket there where before their consciousness gets like hardwired to society or something.
And while that's absolutely fascinating, I would say there's been some very good, serious research, in addition to what Dr. Kripal's been describing. There's a Dr. Ian Stevenson that has done a great deal of study about this cases of reincarnation experience. There's literally been hundreds of these types of experiences identified in research like this, and I think it offers a very strong, compelling argument. But you're right, mainly it's children, and often very young children. Other researchers are seeing that too. They remember their prior lives. Interestingly, as these very young children get older, they seem to lose that that memory, and so they don't really retain it. It's very unusual. One reason I'm so fascinated about that is we have this concept of reincarnation quite regularly expressed in near-death experiences. And I'm going to admit this, okay? When I started my near-death experience research, I thought, no way, reincarnation doesn't make any sense. I didn't believe in that stuff at all. However, I'm led by evidence, and so over and over, and we're talking about way over 100, hundreds at this point of near-death experiences I've studied, do talk about remembrance of a prior life. Now, in my reincarnation evidence in near-death experiences, there's not that predisposition for males. They say their prior life or lives that they remember. Interestingly, even if they're a male or female in this life, they may have been a male or female in prior lives, but or had multiple sort of different genders, often going back. So I'm not really seeing that preponderance of males. And also in near-death experiences, there's not that preponderance of remembrance of a traumatic death. When you have reincarnation discussed in near-death experiences, and maybe that's the explanation, they're just living mundane lives. I mean, I wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe it if everybody talked about that they were Cleopatra in a prior life. Well, you just don't see that in near-death experiences. When they do remember and have some details of their prior life, I mean, they're very mundane, very what you would have expected from decades to centuries ago. Nothing what we'd call particularly special, but it is that remembrance, and often a very detailed remembrance of their life or prior lives. So again, near-death experiences times now hundreds, providing some further lines of evidence for the reality of near-death experience. And I guess to convince myself, because I was such a skeptic of reincarnation, I guess I kind of looked at it from the point of view that if you really believe we're in a universe of infinite possibility, then to say something is impossible or can't happen, well, you're on thin ice. And so I think that's part of the rationale that if we're really in a universe where anything's possible, well, that would by definition include reincarnation, and now with near-death experiences, and Dr. Cripple and other researchers, there's some really pretty solid evidence that that really happens.
Have you ever dealt with like a young child who had a near-death experience? Mm-hmm. Did those differ from older people?
Well, glad you asked, because I've actually studied that. So I am very curious as a researcher about whether near-death experiences in very young children, my study group was age 5 and younger. The median and average age was 3.5 years old. These are very young children. And shoot, Danny, they're practically a cultural blank slate at that young age.
Right.
I mean, gosh, they almost certainly don't have any well-formed religious beliefs. They wouldn't understand death. They've almost certainly not heard about near-death experiences at that tender young age. So when people have a near-death experience at that young age, my interest as a researcher was, well, what about the content of these experiences? How does that compare to older children and adults? So I looked at 33 elements or questions in my survey that were related to what actually happens during the near-death experience in a group of, I believe it was like 23 that we found that were in that group, compared to older children and adults. And to my astonishment, I found there was no statistical difference in the response to any of those 33 questions. So amazingly, very young children seem to have identical near-death experiences as older children and adults. And in fact, there was a Dr. Sutherland who reviewed all prior literature about children's near-death experiences. Her conclusion, as with mine, is that there doesn't seem to be in any way any effect of even very young age on the content of a near-death experience.
That's interesting.
I do want to emphasize, for the very, very young children, I mean, they're a lot more likely, for instance, to have a loving presence with them. There may be, you see sometimes a little bit of a hint or a signal that they're having this at a very young age when they don't have a lot of prior life,
right?
And to remember to recall. But as far as the actual things that occur during a near-death experience, out-of-body experience, encountering deceased loved ones, light, awareness of love, et cetera, then it's, again, strikingly similar to older children and adults.
So what sort of after effects do these people experience after their NDE?
Well, as you can imagine, having such a profound experience generally affects people very, very deeply and very much affects them for the rest of their life. Interestingly, I'm just now putting the final touches on a manuscript, an article, which is going to be the largest study of near-death experiences ever reported. It's that group of 834 near-death experiencers that completed our most recent version of the survey that we have. So I looked specifically at changes in values, changes in beliefs, changes in belief about God. And in this study, I compared it to a group of 42 people that had a life-threatening event but did not have an experience at the time of their life-threatening event, and looked at how their values and beliefs changed, their belief about God. So what we're finding in this study with pending publication is the people that had a near-death experience had much more profound changes in their values and belief. They were much more compassionate. They were much less materialistic. They were much more much more literally changed. They had a much higher belief in God, a much higher belief in the reality of an afterlife as compared to that group that nearly died but didn't have a near-death experience. So it shows that near-death experiences and these often profound changes, what we call after effects, is not due so much, in fact hardly at all, to that life-threatening event, but it's due to the fact that they had that very profound mystical, spiritual experience that seems to have guided them in changing, often radically, throughout the rest of their life.